Hello and welcome to What Would Jane Do? My name is Julia Golding. I am an author, but also a great admirer of Jane Austen and follow her in a sort of an academic way as well as a writer. And I'm joined, as I am usually, by my wonderful podcast partner, Kate Macfalane. Kate, do you want to say a little bit about your relationship with Jane Austen?
My relationship with Jane Austen. Uh, a reader since the age of 12, when I didn't really understand much about her writings in a wider sense. I just enjoyed the stories for what they were. And then later on in life, I became a Regency reenactor. So read her with more of a historical perspective in mind. And I now attend the Jane Austen Festival in Bath with my regiment, the 33rd Foot, providing this year a whole camp full of redcoats. So
We're going to
I
be in a
sort of
flutter.
everyone's in a fluster
Going
when
to
they.
elope, all of us in one move. Excellent. Right, so put that in your diaries, everybody. We're going to elope in September. Right. So we've chosen a subject today which is really more on my side of sort of interest, really,
Mm,
which is because I've written a novel with HarperCollins recently called The Persephone Code, which it's set in 1812, so that's absolutely Jane Austen prime
spot on.
territory.
Yeah.
But it's about the secret societies that were bubbling away underneath our Georgian and Regency world. So just so that you get your historical underpinning, we're in the Georgian period until 1811 when Prince Regent takes over from his dad, and then it becomes the Regency until the death of his father. So it's basically mainly the 1810s is the Regency period, which you'll know from Bridgerton and other things. That's that period we're talking about. And in a way, this is the end of the 18th century as it transforms into the Victorian period. So a lot of these societies come out of the interests
Mm,
of the 18th century, which is the world in which Jane's father grows up and her mother, of course. And a lot of the ideas in the household are really 18th century ideas. And I was particularly drawn to some of the more kind of extreme societies. So the two that I look at in my novel are the Hellfire Society, which starts in the early 18th century as a form of radical lampooning of society. So very irreligious, risque parties, orgies, that kind of thing, breaking moral codes, a place where people could get together and let their hair down. Uh, and it involves some of the highest members of society. So one of the key people in it is a guy called Sir Francis Dashwood, who was also Chancellor of the Exchequer, which is the Minister of Finance. Uh,
yes. I was looking up, doing a little bit of research on the Hellfire Club, as we were going to talk about it. And I thought it was highly amusing that I found a reference to it in Fodor's Travel. It's very, very sort of elite travel company that says the Hellfire Club, where British elites practiced pagan rites and bacchanalian orgies. And the inference was, you can too if you come along on our
yeah,
travel.
come along, join in.
But it also mentioned a little bit of history, and it said members, which I think when it started out, they only had about 12 members officially that were supposed not to know each other and all sort of attended in masks and monks' robes and things. But it said apparently this is later on was discovered that there were a dozen MPs, First Lord of the Admiralty, son of the Archbishop of Canterbury, and Benjamin Franklin, who
Yeah,
seems to get everywhere,
that's
who
right.
was actually in London from the 1750s to the 1770s as a representative, ostensibly, of the Pennsylvania Assembly. And Francis Dashwood, as you said, was Chancellor of the Exchequer, which could be argued to be like the second most powerful man in England, because he who holds the purse strings has a lot of power. And I think he's worthy of a film or a book entirely on his own because he's led the most incredible life. But it just goes to show that I think he started up the club ostensibly as a sort of appreciation of Italian art. And I love the quote by Horace Walpole, the writer, who says, "It was a club for which the nominal qualification is having been to Italy, and the real one being drunk."
Yeah, it was actually there was someone before Francis Dashwood who sort of set the ball rolling, shall we say?
Yes.
But then it was because Francis Dashwood had the great house plus he rented a place called Medmenham Abbey, which is
Mhm.
a fallen down ruin at the time.
Yes.
And then he also used some excavations on his own land called the Hellfire Cave. So he was the
Yes.
person who made it possible in that generation.
Mm.
But that's a little bit before Jane Austen's time.
Yes.
But the idea takes root. And when you get to Jane Austen's generation, you've got people like Byron,
Mm.
who has Newstead Abbey in Nottinghamshire, which again is a fallen down. Well, it's one of these Henry VIII
Knocked it around a bit.
relocations into the aristocracy.
Yes. Mm.
But he, as a youngster, would hold parties there very much in the spirit of the Hellfire Club. I don't think, not necessarily you can identify yourself as a member of that kind of world by then, opposed to being a formal guest list. Things like his gardener dug up a skull in the grounds, which must have belonged to one of the monks who were buried. And
Yes.
Byron, rather than say, "Oh, let's give it a burial," he sent it off to London, had it polished and made into a drinking cup.
Yeah, so very irreverent, isn't it?
Yeah, and then use this for his kind of frat parties, we would call them, I think.
Yes.
So the Hellfire spirit is still running underneath society in Jane Austen's day. And I believe that if you're a fan of Regency historical romances, there's quite a few people who kind of
yes,
idea
guilty.
So I've read Regency romances that use this. In the Persephone Code, I'm fascinated by the sort of the way it undermines society, because it is running as a parallel, sort of a bit like the Masons, that kind of idea. It's got their own set of
rules and regulations. Yes, and it's. I mean, people have always had conspiracy theories, and oh well, you know why so and so got into this powerful position because their face fits and they belong to the right clubs and things like that. And I think, to be honest, in my opinion, most of those societies aren't that secret. And, it's fairly obvious what's going on in terms of power broking and things like that. They don't have to be that secret. They can just get away with it anyway. But it's always intriguing, isn't it, to think about people running the world behind the scenes.
Exactly. You have set this up nicely for, let's say, hurrah for the Illuminati. Illuminati come in at this time as well. And anybody out there who knows anything about conspiracy theories, there is current conspiracy theory that the Illuminati are the secret power behind everything. Yeah. But anyway, who are the Illuminati? They do come out of this period. They start in Bavaria, so they're a German concept, and they're very much a sort of rational Enlightenment project, i.e., we must be ruled by reason, that kind of side of the debate, rather than religion and passion and feelings. Is that
and you can kind of see why, with the world in turmoil, it must be so attractive to people to say, please, let's stop fighting, let's reason things out and have some logic here.
Yeah. No, I'm anti any secret societies, just as on point.
Yes, me too.
Anyway, the reason they really get sort of, famous is because there is a suggestion towards the end of the 1790s that they were behind the French Revolution. I don't think the evidence for this is very strong. I think it's more that the people who kicked off that revolution shared the same Enlightenment values.
Yes.
Not that they were actually saying, right, we, the Illuminati, are going to meet in shadowy corners and plan this. I think it's probably not. But anyway, let's go with the idea that maybe they are. So once you get the idea there's this powerful group, the idea itself becomes very attractive. And as a writer, it's very tempting to invent because they're secret, we don't know, maybe they were really pulling strings. So that's our two big sort of dark undercurrent societies, the Illuminati and the Hellfire Club. And then above them, you've got the Masons, the Freemasons, who obviously are a well-known group. Who
ostensibly very charitable.
Yes, and
were famous for sort of giving tithes of their everybody, I think, has to give a percentage of their income to charitable causes and things like that, ostensibly.
Yeah. and they come out of a medieval guild system of Masons.
Yeah.
They're the ones with those ceremonies, all that stuff. And we do know that many of the founding fathers in America were connected to them. So that was definitely a factor running underneath this period. But of course, it's a male-only society. So it's not going to be something Jane Austen is going to belong to, is it? She's not the right person, but it's possible that people in her world did.
Yes, absolutely. It was very interesting. I went to America to visit a historical site, and one of the buildings they had at this historical site was run by the Masons. It was an old Masons lodge about the time of the sort of 1700s. And a Freemason, understandably, was there telling you about the society. It was very interesting. But I was sort of abruptly put in my place when he went to shake my husband's hand, and I put out my hand to shake his as well, and he absolutely blanked me. And I thought he didn't even raise his hand or anything. He just sort of ignored the fact that I put my hand out to shake his. And I thought, well, that's not a way to win followers and influence people, because
No.
you've just put me against the Masons now. I'm a non-entity. And I thought it was highly amusing that they still had that attitude. There is a female Freemason society, as far as I'm aware, but it's very much the men on their side and the women on their side, which isn't very forward thinking in my view. But there you go, that's just my view. But I thought even that in the 20th century, there's still these divides going on.
And I think what you've just picked up on there, which we find shocking, actually, Jane Austen would totally have expected, because
yes,
we were thinking through which were the societies and clubs. Almost every single one of them is male only. So let's go through the kind of clubs which people in higher society of the sort of stature of the Mr. Darcys and Mr. Bingley would belong to. I've got a few on my list. Who's your
I've
star?
got quite a few. I found in alphabetical order. There was this one called the AA, which is absolutely anonymous. I don't know what on earth that stood for, but some of the names kind of intrigue you. So there's something called the Calves Head Club. Maybe that was a dining club. Committee of 300, Confederacy, British group, Gormongans, Grand Order of Water Rats. Now, I think that's something to do with maybe the barges on the Thames.
Yeah,
or
these
something
come
like
out of
barges.
the professional organizations,
Exactly,
dining
and
clubs,
that's
basically.
yes, and the Hellfire Club, obviously, Hermetic Order of Golden Dawn, the Horseman's Word, Invisible Cottage. I like the sound of. I don't know what the heck that was. Knights of Seth, and there were lots of clubs stemming from knightly orders. National Action, and the Night Climbers of Oxford. Have you heard of those?
Oh, do they scale buildings?
I think they probably do
Like
at
student
night.
care type
Yes,
things, yeah.
that sounds very interesting. Nordic League, Odin Brotherhood. So again, harking back to older times. Order of Turonia, Order of Free Gardeners, and Ordo Templi Orientis, the Right Club, and my favourite, the School of Night, which is famous through Elizabethan Tudor shenanigans. Scotch Cattle, Sealed Knot, which has resonance for me because that's a reenactment group these days. If you mention the Sealed Knot, that's not what it meant then. United Order of the Druids was the last one. So that's just a few ones I found. I'm sure there were many, many more than those, but some of them had some very intriguing titles and still mysterious, even though you know what they're called.
Yeah, so I went slightly more upscale even than that. I was thinking, well, one obvious place is the gentlemen's clubs.
Yes.
The Whites and Brooks and places like that. So
yes.
there's that. And then there's also the sporting clubs that
The
you
Four
can,
Horse Club.
yeah, you
My
can
favourite.
come. Piers Egan is like the sporting journalist of this era, if you want to
Yes.
look this up. A lot of it is around boxing or horse racing or being masters of the hunt in a local area or hare coursing, so hunting related.
And it's interesting that the English fashions of the time are all sporting.
Yeah.
And it was very much you look fit, you look as though you could jump on a horse at any minute. And it was also plainer because of that, because it had to be, well, to their minds, practical. It doesn't look very practical to us today, but they were all wearing buckskin breeches and coats that you could shrug into, and belcher handkerchiefs sort of denote I could drive a coach if I need to, and many cape greatcoats and things like that. But it was quite distinct from the French style, which was fancier.
Yeah, we're definitely going to do one on clothes. But one of the little snippets I've been doing research about this recently is women at this era wear an overcoat, which is called a redding coat,
That's right.
which is the word riding coat gone to France and come back again
Yes.
in this sort of slightly,
Yes.
Chinese whispers way. So the riding fashion, which is still affecting the male suit even today, in particular, is really a sporty look. It's a bit our era came up with, I don't know when it was, the 80s, came up with the sweatpant look. They came up with like breeches and riding a bit more sexy, to be honest.
It's always interesting, isn't it, how fashion circles around?
Yeah.
And if you know anything about past fashions, you can see fashion repeating itself in various different ways.
Yeah.
I love living now because you can wear practically absolutely anything. Whereas the style of the Regency times was very prescribed by certain things, and you couldn't go too much out of there.
People are quite anxious about having sleeves the right length and things like that.
Yes,
In a way, these small differences, which I've totally lost on me now, I wouldn't know. But anyway, just carrying on in this, back to the society thing. So we've got that sort of sporting area, and we've got the gentlemen's club and the dining clubs that you mentioned. But you've also got the explosion of intellectual clubs.
Yes, lots of scientific clubs and lots of subscriptions to scientific journals.
Yeah, so of course, the Royal Society is set up earlier. That's the sort of Wren and Newton bunch, but it's still going strong. You've got the Royal Institution, which has a sort of club-like atmosphere, and women are allowed to attend lectures there. So you've got Humphrey Davy, who's demonstrating science, and then it goes on, the next gen after Jane's died is Faraday, Michael Faraday, and electricity.
Yes, of course, leading to Frankenstein, famously.
Yes, well, kind of. Frankenstein is a bit before. That's more Galvani, and
yes,
that's another thing. But the important thing is that some scientific doors were open.
Yes.
But the club aspect was very important because it was where people shared information. So things like the Royal Society and others sponsored exploration, Mungo Park, great name, Mungo Park, going off to explore Africa and things. And Joseph Banks,
yes,
was a great figure at the time, sort of encouraging people to go out, and he went out in his youth as well with Captain Cook to find new
this explosion in horticulture, with people being able to travel more and collect things more.
And the information about this is shared in clubs. This is what this is why I'm coming back to. And you've got things like the Geological Society, which is set up at this time and still runs, because working out the age of the Earth, finding fossils, the stuff that leads to the woman scientist people might know, Mary Anning, comes from this era of imagine I'm a clergyman like Jane's father on my own, and I'm pottering around on my holidays, and I dig up a skeleton at Lyme Regis. What do I do with it? Well, I go into my club. That's how it's basically our equivalent now is conferences and online, but they're finding other ways of this. A lot of it is done by letter, of course.
Yes, and correspondence, and there's that's why we have the knowledge of the time today, is the amount of correspondence that was kept between famous or famous later on philosophers, scientists, mathematicians. So you don't have that really today, in terms of there's such an explosion of information. Information is everywhere, but you don't have such a sort of concentrated idea of where it's come from necessarily, and whether it's even true.
Yeah, I mean, now it's basically all mainly rests in academia. So if you've got, my son's doing a doctorate, and he spends all his time desperately reading, because there's so much stuff out now, so many papers, so much to know.
It's incredible.
It's like a huge tidal wave of stuff coming at each person in a speciality, or specialty, as our American listeners will think. So these groups. So we've done the Gentlemen's Club and that dining society world. We've done sporting clubs. We've done intellectual clubs. Just sort of dropping down to a more middle class, which does include the scientific stuff, we get to some people who aren't centered on London, which are really interesting. So you've got things like the Lunar Society.
Mm-hmm.
Lunar Society include the sort of industrial pioneers like Bolton, the people who come up with the your steam engine and little things like that.
Little things like that.
But someone like Joseph Priestley, who is a fascinating man, who's both a chemist and a Unitarian priest and a political thinker and a philosopher. And I know from my own studies that the Lunar Society, its name is given because they used to meet in them somewhere in the Midlands. So the Midlands, for those of you who don't know UK, it's around Birmingham, that area.
Yes.
If you get your map out, they used to meet at the full moon so that they could travel for their dinner parties.
Yeah, so which makes utter
in,
sense if you know the Regency period. Yeah,
get home when it's in the light. So they laughingly, it's a joke, called themselves the Lunar Society, and there were definitely women adjacent to this group. So there's a poet called Mrs. Barbauld, for example, who writes a poem about experimenting on mice. She's not keen on them experimenting on mice because they were doing these vacuum experiments.
Yes.
But she's part of that intellectual world. And Richard Edgeworth, who's Maria Edgeworth, the writers, her father was part of this, and she also knew their world. So that is slightly more open to wives and daughters and people.
Yes. Yes, and I'm sure lots of sisters and wives and cousins were involved in the recording of data, but very rarely allowed to actually take part in it as writing actual taking part in correspondence with the society. But they would have very much been aware of what was going on and probably ones that were interested in it, trying to take part any way they could.
Except with the honourable mention for my favourite scientist. You know what I'm going to say, don't you?
I know what you're going to say.
Caroline Herschel.
Yay!
Big cheer, Caroline Herschel. The reason I'm getting very excited about that is because I've written a play about her, which I would really love somebody to,
take
put
up
on somewhere else. But she took the extraordinary step in the 1790s of actually writing herself to the Royal Society and to those who ran science at that time.
And was actually acknowledged by them as an expert, which was great.
She wasn't allowed to be a member. She was given an honorary membership towards the end of her life. But,
just to be acknowledged is a major feat in that time.
Anyway, so we got to not ignore the vast majority of society. There were a whole network of working men's societies, many of whom the records for this won't survive. And of course, there will be religious groups as well, which let's put those to one side because that's a whole massive other.
Yes.
But groups like the London Corresponding Society, which was a kind of debate and political group, and these were the sort of areas where the government gets very nervous because forget the Illuminati, how does the French Revolution starts?
Yes.
American, I suppose. It starts with these uppity normal people getting together and saying
together in clubs and saying, you know what, I don't think this is very fair.
Exactly. Yeah. So that's a grand tour of clubs and societies in Jane Austen's day. Our question is always, what would Jane do about it? So, Kate, where do you see Jane's interaction with this world that's such a big influence on how it shapes that time?
Well, I think she would have been obviously aware of it through her brothers, through her father, and lots would be discussed at the dinner table. She had obviously people visiting from far and wide as well. She had the cousin that joined them fresh from the French Revolution. So I'm sure politics and societies and ideas of the day would have been discussed at the dinner table, especially when she went to house parties, and she visited her brother in London, of course. So I'm sure one of the things you would have done is go out and see scientific displays and things like that. But whether she would have actually wanted to join in on clubs and societies, it would have been nice for her to speak with authors she was influenced by. But I don't know, I'm not aware of her necessarily corresponding with Fanny Burney or anyone like that. No. So it's kind of sad, really, that when you think of that people these days can literally Facebook their favorite author and just give them encouragement and say, you know, how much they've enjoyed being influenced by them. But authors then were very, very isolated and to the point of anonymity initially, of not daring to publish under their own name if they were a woman. So it makes it even more impressive that they achieved the success they did when they were very much cast off by society. Well, not cast off, but certainly put in a little pigeonhole aside by society if they dared to come out of the norm of being a wife and mother and homemaker. They were seen as oddities, blue stockings, derided for daring to step away from the stereotype and want something different for themselves, I suppose. But I imagine within the sort of middle class society that Jane was moving in, women would have delighted in getting together, even under the guise of sewing groups, reading groups, horticultural societies, and anything that they were allowed to get together outside of the home for. They would have enjoyed and obviously shared knowledge and advice and possibly views on society and science and things like that.
I think that she probably didn't. I don't think it would have occurred to her that she might belong, because it was such an impossibility.
Yeah.
And I think what women were doing were creating their own equivalent societies, be it sharing, sewing a quilt, or providing things for the poor, kind of charitable act, or sharing patterns and buying things for each other, though men were also involved in that, buying sort of. There's networks and groups. But I think one thing that all the men's groups I've mentioned share in common is they're outside of domestic space.
Yes, absolutely. Whereas women's groups tend to be very much about, let's see how we can help those less fortunate than ourselves. Certainly women of any influence, they were allowed to form societies to improve society, but it would be very much frowned on if they had a gambling club or any of the clubs or a sporting club that the equivalent that the men had.
There were sporting clubs, though. There is quite good evidence that women's cricket was quite a big thing, which I found really surprising. I was reading about it. I thought, wow, okay. So there were sporting. I think I'm getting the sense we don't have a good handle on this yet. I'd be fascinating to see if there's any really good research going on about women's participation in societies, not society, but society clubs.
Yes, I'm sure there must have been, but as so often happens, the records are lost because they're not deemed interesting enough or worthy enough to rank alongside all the men's one.
I think there's a difference between Steventon and the other sort of like village world that she lived in, and when she was in Bath and when she was visiting in London. Because in Bath, I'm remembering, this is where we perhaps dip into some of her novels. I remember in Persuasion, which is her novel written right towards the end of her life, there is definitely a sense of everyone is moving in a very undomestic world.
Yes, definitely. What about Lady Russell going into the pump room and saying to her friends, how did the society talk about the atheists? Were they routed or something like that? So there was obviously a debating society in Bath that ladies and gentlemen would be allowed to attend. So there were things that were, if they sort of came across as harmless or not too radical for the ladies, I'm sure they could attend those little talks, general talks that men and women could attend together.
Yeah, I think it would be unusual, almost exceptional, for a woman to be speaking.
Yes, but she could attend and listen and not sort of put her head above the parapet, but certainly sort of listen to the men debating. Possibly.
And there were some areas to thinking about representation. There were some areas where people of like former slaves, Africans, would be able to speak. So the radical groups like the London Corresponding Society, Piano was part of that, but also any abolition groups, which of course also include women.
Yes, absolutely.
That's a kind of society. It's like a political campaigning group that very much gave women a chance to be active in petitions, well, it's an anachronistic term, but the boycotts of sugar and slave-made goods and things.
Yes, and if you think about women being, well, not all women, but women sort of dictating maybe the menu for their house, if not going out and shopping for it. Women seen as domestic, but there is power in domesticity in terms of if you are ordering the menu and ordering the food for your house and the goods for your household, whether you're a housekeeper or a lady, then you can affect change by saying we're not buying a certain product. In this case, sugar, to support slavery.
Yes, so I think there's definitely a big role for women as reformers, educational reformers, prison reformers, factory working conditions reformers. Not much fun though.
No, but it had to be very worthy. That's the thing. So yes, whereas a lot of men's clubs were based around exciting discoveries in science and horticulture and things, and lots of drinking, gambling, sports, the women still had to be seen to be worthy and worthwhile and very dull, ostensibly. Although I'm sure the women inside them made they were as entertaining as possible. But they had to be seen to be improving if you're a woman, not step out of your sphere too much.
Okay, so let's think about what would Jane do about secret societies. So let's first of all think about, is there any evidence in her novels? Like, who do you think amongst her characters would be the kind of person to belong to these male secret and other societies?
One that leapt out at me was probably Captain Tilney, because I think in the film, whether it says in the book, I can't remember, he lures the friend of Catherine Morland to seduce her, and it shows him almost like being in a whether it's a brothel or certainly a den of ill repute, and there's gambling going on and all sorts, and he sort of takes her into a room to seduce her. But certainly he would be a captain in the army, so he'd have some money, he'd have lots of people looking for fun on off duty, and he'd have some money, and expectations as an eldest son of coming into a larger inheritance. So he probably would have got a lot of credit at gambling joints, and he was just a typical fancy free young man. Didn't care. A rake, exactly. Willoughby and Wickham, definitely.
If they were allowed.
If they were allowed, and if they actually had some money, then definitely they would be all in for any society where pleasure was the theme.
I can see Bingley's father rather than Bingley himself being a lunar society man. I've got a feeling Bingley might be a little bit too he's not the brightest button, is he? I don't think.
No, and he cares. Why he is such a nice hero is he clearly cares about what other people's feelings are, and a lot of Jane Austen's characters who we are against are utterly selfish. So they're not necessarily. I was thinking, with regard to the Hellfire Club, a lot of people would say, oh, these people were evil. They were out for themselves. They were allegedly debauching virgins, spitting on religion, doing everything that they could to appear wicked. And I thought, well, Jane Austen's characters, I wouldn't describe them necessarily as wicked. I would describe them as bad, some of them, and certainly self-serving, but they're not what I would describe as evil and debauched and things like that. So they're all very fallible people, and that's what makes them interesting, is that you could, if you wanted to, defend them by saying, well, that they're doing this out of motivation of self-interest, and they would never describe themselves as doing something wicked, but even though the results might be.
I think one of the key, maybe Mr. Bennet is in one of these societies. I can imagine him belonging to something like the Geological Society or something.
Yes, a philosophical society.
Going to a library and writing letters to other people. But I think one of the things about what Jane Austen does so brilliantly is that we feel that the relationships she sets up, the key relationships, the Emma, Mr. Knightley, the Elizabeth, Mr. Darcy, and so on, that they actually want to spend time with each other.
And discuss things. Yes, it's not all about bodice ripping. It's actually a meeting of minds.
They're two friends who eventually, friendship is the highest form of love.
Yes.
In that case, so that you feel that Mr. Darcy doesn't want to rush off to, I don't know, the Royal Society every 5 minutes, because he's quite happy running his life with Elizabeth. So in a sense, it's not relevant to their relationship. And it's only those who might not find satisfaction within the home who might you might feel have that pull outside the home, like like the Mr. Bennets of this world. So I think that in a way the society's run counter to a happy domestic life. Doesn't mean
yes,
but I've got a feeling that there's a sense of this is the foundational location for the relationships is the home that gets up together, be it a big estate like Pemberley or just a little vicarage.
Yes, you couldn't imagine Mr. Collins joining one of these societies. He probably might want to be included in one of these societies.
Charlotte would be desperate to.
Charlotte would be desperate to get him on the gardening club or something. But I don't think anyone would want to invite him, unless it was to exploit him in some way. Whereas I'm sure Mr. Darcy, Mr. Bingley would have been getting invites all the time to lend some prestige to a club.
So I suppose we should round this up, really. So in a way, this is a subject area which is outside Jane Austen's experience, that we feel as though parts of her family, the world around her, was deeply embedded in this. But as a woman, it's actually very interesting how little access people have to the entertainment and educational and
I suppose it's only through how enlightened your male relatives are and how much they allow you to be included in political discussions, things like that. And I'm sort of not thinking of the elite hostesses of the Regency world, like Caroline, Duchess of Devonshire and things. Those were the exceptions to the rule, in that they were political hostesses, the famous
ones who ran salons, basically.
Exactly. So they would have musical salons, they would have philosophical salons, and those would be areas where people would gather and discuss the high thoughts of the day, and were very popular and had enormous prestige. But again, it was still largely the women organising them. The hostesses organising them, but the men coming to discuss what was going on and set the world to rights.
And that's why in my book, The Persephone Code, I actually went for an actress as the person who is going to be investigating what's going on.
Outside the social norms and therefore has more agency.
Because you need, when you're writing that, you need somebody who's got a bit of flexibility to access all areas. And
yes, absolutely.
Gives you that sort of ability. Anyway, Kate, thank you so much for discussing secret societies with me, and not so secret societies. Before we leave, have you got any Jane Austen news or any recommendations in the Jane Austen world, adjacent to the Jane Austen world, that you'd like?
Yes, I have a little news. So the Jane Austen Festival Friends, this is organised by the Jane Austen Centre in Bath. Tickets will be on sale starting from the 1st of May. For festival friends only, but there's a very exciting ball that I want to attend, which this year is going to be the Gothic Ball at the end, and you get to dress up in your Gothic finery, obviously swan around the Roman baths first before going into the pump rooms and having a jolly time in there. So I'm sure that will be very popular. The Jane Austen Literary Foundation short story competition closes on the 28th of April. So if you are a budding author yourself and you have a short story in you, please go and look at their website and pop in your story. And the prize is you get Alison Larkin reading out your story, and it's in a collection of Audible stories, so you can be practically published. And finally, Caroline Jane Knight, a friend of this podcast.
Yes.
She says the organisers of the Sanditon celebration, which is taking place physically in Guildford, have released tickets to attend by interactive live stream. So that's what Jane Austen would have liked to interact with authors across the globe. This is on the 14th, 15th of June. So people around the world can attend virtually, which is very good. So I'll maybe send you a link for that later on.
Excellent. And I suppose my only bit of news, very adjacent, is that we've got Bridgerton season 3 coming back.
Oh my goodness, yes. I'll put it in my diary.
So we should definitely take that apart. I mean, review it. I kind of love it in a way. As long as I don't,
do. It's something you.
As long as I don't
My
attach it too much to real
my
history, that's
husband,
fine.
who, as Richard says, loves anything historical and historical facts, hates Bridgerton with an absolute passion.
I can
And
imagine. It's
if you
fairy
want to,
tale. It's not
if you
real.
want to wave a red flag in front of him, just mention the B word. Whereas I love Bridgerton in the sense that it's absurd, it's utterly silly, it's a romantic fiction brought to life, and we'll probably have to do a podcast on what would
We
Jane
will.
Austen think about
Yeah.
Bridgerton, because that's a whole. I can easily ramble on for an hour about
Yeah.
that, but I think it's just fun.
Yeah. Right. Thank you so much, Kate. And we look
I
forward
was
to.
for those of you able to view this podcast, I have my hair down. I have my gothic attire on for somebody obviously ready to be debauched by the Hellfire Club. I haven't
Oh
got a
yes, sorry.
nun's
You're in dishabille, as they say.
yes, I am. But I didn't have a nun's outfit. But apparently they dressed up as nuns and monks just to be extra
Yeah,
scurrilous.
just for fun. Yeah. Well, my
I
character
didn't have
gets
one
to
of
dress
those.
up as a nun, not
There
willingly.
you go. Not willingly.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks very much.
Okay, thanks, Julia. Bye, everyone.